Hello and welcome to another episode of the Classical Republican. Today I am joined by Dr. Peter Stone, who teaches at Trinity College, Dublin, and is an advocate for sortition. He has written books and articles on the issue and is a regular contributor to the blog equalitybylot.com. And I have a video on that that you can see for reference. So, Dr. Stone, can you tell us about sortition and why it's good?
Sure. I am happy to do that. So sortition is the practice of selecting people for public responsibilities, for public office by lottery. And there are a number of arguments that have been made in favor of them. I think that probably the most interesting of them personally is that it is a way of bringing people into the political process on equal terms. And that way, I think it's something that's very much like the right to vote or something like that, a way of acknowledging the equal place of all citizens as having a stake in the political process.
Please tell us about your involvement in equalitybylot.com.
Well, my involvement with the blog actually goes literally back to its beginning. I was in the 1990s, I was working on my dissertation, which was on sortition. And I became part of a network of researchers called the Claritarians, named after the Athenian machine for conducting random selection, which I know you're familiar with there. So I became part of that network. And while I was doing my work, I was living out in California by the early 2000s. And it was at that time that I met Yoram Gat, who was not an academic, but who had a serious enthusiasm for the idea of random selection as a way of overcoming the corruption and the other problems that were plaguing electoral democracy. So he and I met up, and in our conversations, we decided that a blog would be a good idea. And so Yoram decided to get that off the ground, and that's how Equality by Lot was born. And he has put in heroic efforts into building that ever since then.
Okay. Now, you're an advocate for sortition. Can sortition fit into any regime that wants to have popular input?
I think sortition is a remarkably versatile instrument there. It's capable of doing a number of things and contributing in a number of different places. And I think, for example, the contributions it's making to some of our contemporary politics are quite different from the contributions it might have been making in the days of ancient Athens. So they are often very different ways it can be brought in. For example, it can contribute to very democratic systems, extremely egalitarian political systems like Athenian democracy. It can also contribute to political systems that were much less egalitarian and democratic, like, for example, the Venetian city-state during the Renaissance, a very aristocratic society, and yet sortition played an important role in it as well.
What do you think about the Venetian ballot?
The Venetian use of sortition is really interesting, I think, because it really shows the range of options that you can do with it. So in Venice, unlike in a lot of contemporary uses, the idea wasn't, okay, we've got a bunch of political officials, we'll select them by lot. The idea was more like, well, we need a group of people to elect the candidate, or perhaps to nominate candidates. And so how are we going to decide who's going to do that? Who's going to be doing the nominating or the selecting? Well, they don't have everyone vote on it. They would have a randomly selected group of people do that. And in fact, most famously, the Doge of Venice was selected in this incredibly complicated, he was a head of state, this incredibly complicated process that involved election and sortition, election, sortition, election, sortition, very, very complicated use. And that combination of election and sortition just shows how versatile it is. And maybe I should just mention one interesting contemporary use that has been proposed that kind of parallels the Venetian case. There are arguments that for example, you could try to come up with a procedure a little bit like that for selecting, let's say, political candidates instead of primaries or something like that. There's also people who say that, well, maybe we should have some combination of election and sortition to select the Supreme Court judges or federal judges. You could have people select, okay, we'll select a group of people who are all equally qualified, so they'll be, elected. But if we agree, okay, these are all qualified, which one actually gets on the court? We pick them at random. That has been, one of many innovative ideas for combining election and sortition.
Okay. So you brought up, selecting people for the judiciary. What are the issues that have to be considered when you're thinking of a different branch of government? Say a legislative or an executive candidate that you want to have selected through sortition?
Well, one of the most important things I think you need to consider is numbers. How many people are you going to need? I think that sortition is something that very naturally goes with political offices that are numerous, when you've got a group of people to be selected. I think sortition, for example, to select the president all by itself without anything else would be a rather bad idea. Randomly grab any American citizen. I think that's a really bad idea there, because, yes, you could get someone great or you get someone crazy or something like that. If you're selecting 400 people, then obviously you'll get one crazy person, but it's much less danger of that. And if you look, for example, at what the ancient Athenians did, they were always careful pretty much for all of the uses they made of random selection. It was always a group. It was always a group that got where they were selecting random. And because they wanted to say, okay, we could get one guy who's corruptible or one guy who's crazy, one guy who's stupid, but it's one out of a team. You can really control that danger.
Do you think sortition would work well in a bicameral system similar to what James Harrington proposed in his book, The Commonwealth of Oceania? So just for the viewers, what he had is a form of bicameralism. He had a Senate, and they were actually, I believe sortition was used for them, but then there was also the tribal prerogative, which were more average people who would be selected for this other chamber that would decide, while the Senate could propose, and they would also debate amongst themselves, and then they would have to select two people to go and give the pros and cons to the prerogative tribe. What do you think about that form?
I think
that form of bicameralism.
I think Harrington's proposal is very interesting precisely because of the way that it tries to bring together a role for political elites and a role for ordinary citizens, and to say they both have interesting roles to play. And that's one of the more interesting things that fans of sortition debate about, because there are some people who would just as soon get rid of politicians entirely. There is a book out there by the head of the Sortition Foundation, Brett Hennig, called An End to Politicians. It's just saying, let's just get rid of that political elites, we don't need them. But I'd say a lot of the other people who study it are interested in these combinations of how do you bring together, let's say, elected politicians and ordinary citizens to work together. And I'll just mention there were two very interesting proposals on that subject. And in some ways, they're exact opposites of each other. They were brought together. There were two books written on the subject, and they were brought together in a one-volume edition I wrote the preface to. They're called The People's Parliament and a Citizen Legislature. And one of them is a proposal for let's recreate the US government, the US Congress. And one is a proposal for recreating the British Parliament. And in the US example, what was proposed in the Citizen Legislature was, we'll have a House of Representatives selected randomly, And they will do the heavy work of drafting proposals and all of that, and they'll write laws. And then the Senate will be the body of elected officials that will be like they'll be the cool kind of break on the process. In other words, they'll say, okay, we think you came up with something a little crazy there, so let's calm down, let's negotiate, let's come up with something like that. So the idea was the serious work of legislating would be done by ordinary citizens, and it would be these elected political elites that would put a break on them, and keep them under control, that balancing act. If you look at the other proposal for the House of Lords and the House of Commons on how they could be reformed, it's the exact opposite. In that proposal, we have a House of Lords that is selected randomly. So the elected politicians are all in the House of Commons, and they draft all the legislation. The elected officials now drafting all the legislation, doing all the work, and then they send it to the Lords, who are now randomly selected citizens. And then now it's the random citizens who say, hold on, I don't like that, or I think there's a problem with that. I'm going to send it back to you, and let's work it out. In fact, one of the parts of that proposal that I like the most, and on one version of this proposal, there is this idea that you could have random selection of citizens say, send it back, because they're like, well, you know what, this bill you sent us, we can't read it. We don't know what it does, because legislation can often be so complex and difficult that even, good bills and bad bills, they can just be, whether they're good or bad, they can be incredibly dense for ordinary citizens. So to have a group of ordinary citizens just be able to say, look, maybe this is a good law, but could you at least write it in a way where we understand what it does? I think that's a very interesting idea that people should take seriously.
Have you been following House of Lords reform over the past, 20 years? They've been reforming it. I mean, you're closer there, but I don't know if you're actively watching that. Because they've kind of been going into more of an advisory role than a kind of a really, I don't know. I don't know if you can see them really as an equal chamber anymore.
It's a funny situation there. And I mean, I think a lot of people find the idea of a randomly selected House of Lords a little crazy, there. This is one of the kind of ideas that gets tossed around in this book I mentioned, The People's Parliament. It also, there's a wonderful book called The Athenian Option on it. And I think that, it's one of those ideas, the line from Churchill, it's like, this is a terrible idea, except all the other ideas that people could come up with. Because, getting rid of the House of Lords entirely, well, now you've got a single parliament, which, look, a lot of people ain't too happy with the way the House of Commons is operating these days. I mean, if you looked at it right now, I mean, oh boy, it's not doing very well right now. So, but on the other hand, electing the Lords, it's like, what's the point of electing the Lords? It's like, you're just going to get the exact same kind of politicians, and either they'll pass the exact same kind of measures that you get before, or you get gridlock. Neither of those sounds to be like a great option. So it's like, well, what's the alternative there? Well, random selection is one idea that I think is quite interesting. I'll just add one more note about this. A friend of mine in Canada, Arash Abizadeh, he has been involved in debates about the reform of the Canadian Senate. And he convened an interesting workshop on the idea of a randomly selected Canadian Senate of ordinary citizens. And I was present when he ran a panel discussion about this, and it featured a liberal senator to talk about it. And it was a lovely discussion. It was very polite and civil, and I thought productive and intelligent. And like within days, that Canadian senator had published an editorial in the newspaper basically saying, what are these lunatics talking about random selecting the Senate or something like that. It was actually quite funny there to say that, because he was the whole time he was talking to us with a perfectly straight face, and then he goes and writes this editorial basically suggesting we're all bonkers,
All right. For our viewers, this is being recorded on July 12th, and Boris Johnson the Prime Minister has just resigned. So yeah, that just for reference there. A lot of what I've read on equality by lot seems to when we're talking about practice rather than theory. It seems like the sortition has been used to create something that is a little bit more like an advisory council. We have advisory councils, especially, I live in Twin Falls, Idaho. I have served on advisory councils for the city and the county. And so a lot of times the way well, you have kind of a spectrum of these councils that are highly autonomous, like say planning and zoning. They're chaired by one of the members, and they seem to have a lot of control over the agenda and whatnot. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have really just a group that's a little bit more like a what do you call it? Then when you have like a what do you call it when you have like a preference, when you're just looking like an opinion.
Like a poll.
Yeah, like you're just taking a poll.
A focus group maybe, or something like that.
What was it?
Like a focus group.
Yeah, focus group. It's more like a focus group, and you just it's even facilitated by city staff. You have all these experts coming in to kind of handle the people who sit on the committee, and so I mean, what's your experience? And maybe it depends on the situation, but what's your experience? And what would you advocate for using sortition, and how much power would you give to that body, that deliberative body, in our modern times, at a local level, and then maybe at a national level, if there's a big difference there?
Well, I think this is like one of the most kind of contentious topics, as you might have seen from the blog there, is to like how much kind of power, and also like what kind of path you can get to getting that kind of power. Because there are, for example, people who do take the line that like what they'd like to see is randomly selected assemblies replacing elected politicians entirely. Well, there are many questions about like, well, would that work and all that? But one of the other questions that's very important is, well, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, or, as they say, would you really ever get elected politicians to say, yeah, let's give up all power we have and hand it over to these? That's hard to imagine. But at the same time, you don't want these kind of randomly selected groups to be just window dressing. That has been a concern raised. For example, you might have seen the French Climate Assembly that Emmanuel Macron convened. And I think, there's a question about exactly how far along the spectrum was it, because I think it was the grand language said it would be closer to the have real teeth kind of end of it. But I certainly don't want to say it accomplished nothing. It wasn't purely a focus group, but I think it did, it didn't live up to some of the hype that had been raised about it. I actually think that if politicians can recognize their potential, they can do a lot, and they can accomplish a great deal. And even if it's like a particular small place in the system, it can contribute something meaningful. We've been seeing this dance playing out, in Ireland there, because Ireland has now been, over the past few years, become one of the success stories of randomly selected citizens' assemblies being used for navigating very contentious political issues at the heart of the Irish Constitution. And I think there has been, it's not perfect, but there has been a level of trust gained that, yeah, okay, maybe these people can, contribute something real there. So I think there's definitely potential for them to be more than simple advisors. And I definitely think that's a move in the right direction.
How many countries have used sortition in modern times?
That's a very hard to give a count. I was looking up, trying to come up with an answer to that. I'll mention some of the most interesting cases really quick there. One of the most famous, of course, was the citizens' assemblies convened first in British Columbia and then in Ontario to come up with possible proposals for reforming the province's electoral systems, and they were unfortunately unsuccessful. Then you have the Irish case, where we now had a series of these citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies is like the general term I usually use for a lot of these kind of events, to review or come up with proposals for reforming the Irish Constitution. You now have their institutionalization in Belgium these days, at least in the German-speaking part of Belgium. There's now an officially established citizen body that is going to play a role in the process. The city of Paris in France has a similar kind of body that has been created. Mongolia has it now in its, of all places, in its constitution, that if you want to reform the constitution, you need to convene a type of citizen assembly. It's called a deliberative opinion poll, as created by Jim Fishkin. And these are probably some of the most outstanding cases there. There are others I could mention, but these are like the ones that have the most power, the most influence. In terms of ones that have had less influence, that are just purely like what you're describing, like advice to politicians there. They have been convened all over the world. There have been some convened in Africa, all over the United States. China has, of all places, has made use of quite a number of them. I want to say South Korea, I believe, quite a number of other European countries have made use of them. So they really are at this point a worldwide phenomenon. And the question is just how far are countries willing to go in terms of giving them a meaningful say in the political system.
Let's talk a little bit about the composition of a citizens' assembly. How large as far as numbers, but also how representative, how reflective of the society does it need to be? What are the factors that you really need to consider there?
That's a very good question. I think most of the assemblies that have been convened, I used the term citizen assembly before, and that is typically one of the larger of these randomly selected citizen bodies that have been used. There have been experiments that have been smaller on scale, let's say where you bring together just 20 randomly selected people or something like that. That is something like the experiments that came out of, there was a guy who just recently passed away, Ned Crosby, who spent years developing what he called citizen juries. And so he was thinking along the lines of a jury. It'll be like, maybe it'll be 12 people, but it won't be hundreds. It'll be a small body that will come together. But the citizens' assemblies tend to be much larger groups. And I think that there's a lot to be said for larger meaning a couple hundred, let's say 200, 300, 400 people there. The reason for doing that is if you want to have any real sort of demographic diversity, you just can't get that with 12 or even with 20. If you want real meaningful representation in the sense of, are women and men equally represented? Are people of different ethnic groups equally represented? Are people of different geographic locations equally represented? Occupations or income levels, are they equally represented? You need probably a couple hundred, or at least 100, I would say, to have any chance of achieving that. And those are, I'd say, some of the typical dimensions that people talk about. The ones, like, for example, in the Irish experiments, I think, gender was important, geographic location, where are they coming from around Ireland, I think socioeconomic status. One of the contentious questions about of stratifying, of saying, where you say deliberately, I want to make sure that we have proportionate numbers represented, is people's political opinions. That's a contentious one. People argue about that because it's like, well, do you want it? That would mean you have to ask people a whole bunch of intrusive questions about what their politics are, for example, and maybe that would get everything off on the wrong foot, so up for there. And there are other objections to that, I think, as well. Personally, I haven't thought that was as important as getting representation along other the traditional kind of dimensions that often come up when, for example, you're trying to do a public opinion poll.
That's interesting. You brought that up, and I live in Idaho, and we have a few committees, or statewide. Yeah, there are statewide committees that, like the redistricting committee. They just finished up their work early this year, and they were they're required by law to have so many Republicans and so many Democrats, and so that's been kind of weird because we actually had another a county up north who tried to take over the Republicans. We're predominantly Republican, the GOP state, and we had a county where the Republicans had this plot to take over the Democratic Party so they could get more people onto a committee like that. So even though they were registered and they were part of the Democratic committee or Central Committee, they were going to they were actually Republicans who were going to get their people into the Democratic spot on that statewide committee. So yeah, that can be really rough. So let's talk about majoritarianism. How does majoritarianism factor into sortition?
Well, that's a very good question. And there has been debate about the right level of that. For example, when I mentioned the citizen juries that Ned Crosby convened, his model was always jury, that you aim to try to come to a consensus among people there. And of course, consensus can be, it can be very wonderful if you can attain it, but it can be also very, very difficult. And often, the fear often is if you insist on a consensus, well, eventually people are going to get to the point where it's just like, buddy, just shut up and go along with us so we can go home and that kind of thing. And that's why most of these kind of experiments with sortition, they allow for majority voting. They just say, look, we'll put out there, we'll tell you what the vote was, and take it from there. And I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of a model of that. Just saying, look, you can see how many people voted for each side, and you can make your judgment based on that. Because usually a citizens' assembly is not the very last word in the topics. There's somebody else who's got to do something, and well, guess what? You can see how the vote went, and you can take that into account. Was it almost 50-50, or was it, as often is the case, was it overwhelmingly lopsided there? That matters.
If that's the if you have an assembly that's that is very strong and has a lot of power, or closer to the final say, do you think it's more important to have a super majority as opposed to a simple majority, or do you think that that still it's just something that's going to be looked at as how popular it was?
I'm less concerned about the size of the majority. The more power a randomly selected body is, I'll tell you what does concern me more. And I think this is one of the areas where we're just now getting to the point where we can see whether citizens' assemblies can be stress tested, and that is like, well, okay, if they're advisory, then, you could say, okay, the goal is these are not partisan tools. They're not being used by powerful actors to accomplish their end. It's supposed to be, in a sense, an impartial kind of body where people come together and can consider objectively the pros and the cons of different arguments and do what's right. The more power you give them, the more political actors are going to be like, I want to make sure that body gives them the right answer. I don't want them to just conceive of the merits in the abstract. I want them to take my position. And so the question is, can you protect them once the stakes start to get high? Can you protect them against somebody who wants to come in and say, yeah, we've got some money to throw at these people, there, or other ways to suborn the assemblies? I think in general, they're harder to suborn than elected politicians there, because they've got no campaigns to run or something like that. So you'd have to try to resort more almost, outright bribery or threats or things like that. But on the other hand, like I said, it's only now that citizens' assemblies are starting to get real power. So they're getting stress tested now. So we got to think very carefully about how do you protect them from these kind of influences that might try to steer things their way.
Can the trend in sortition be seen as post-liberal or anti-liberal?
That's a really good question, and I suppose the answer to that question depends on how similar or how different you think, let's say, Athenian democracy is to a liberal democracy. Would you call it Athenian democracy? Would you call that liberal? And some people say absolutely not, and some people say, oh yeah, it's got a lot of liberal features to it. So that's going to play an important role. And I personally think there are a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of differences between the Athenian democracy we get and what we have now. So I can talk about that. I personally don't see it as a post-liberal or non-liberal idea. I think there is this stereotype about liberal democracy that says liberal democracy is all about people just going home. And unlike the Athenians and all those ancient world, it's all about people who just want to stay to go make money and leave the politics the professionals. Leave the politics the professionals. Go on to your private life. Have a go into business, make money, leave politics for other people to do. And that's a stereotype of liberalism. I don't think it's a fair stereotype. I also don't think it's fair to Athens, by the way, to think the Athenians was something radically different, because look at Pericles' wonderful funeral oration, his famous speech that the Athenian leader gave about how great the Athenian democracy was. And you know what he said in there? He said, hey, we all have our own private interests. We are all, a lot of us are off running our businesses or making money, or we have our own occupations, but we don't forget politics, because we know we got to keep the system running, and we know we got to keep this free democratic state going. So to me, that's an attitude I think we should definitely be reviving right now, to say, look, you got your private interests, great. You got to worry about the public interest too. And so I don't personally feel like there's anything antithetical to liberal ideas of democracy and embracing that.
Speaking of attitude, a lot of people really don't like jury duty and try to get out of it. Is there any evidence that sortition for a deliberative body would be more popular?
Oh, this is a question that comes up quite a lot, because it's definitely something that experiments with sortition struggle with. For example, with some of the Irish uses of this, the citizens' assemblies for constitutional assembly, you have to ask, if you want to get, let's say, 100 people to take part, you got to ask, a lot of people, thousands, I think you need to ask to get 100. And also the Irish experiences were plagued by a very high attrition rate. A lot of people dropped out and had to be substituted. Now, there's a very obvious explanation for why that happened. They weren't paid. They did not pay them a bloody penny, or something like that, which I think is crazy myself. Because come on, this is not your advocate spend billions to give them a decent pay or something like that. So a lot of the experiments have been like, we'll give you something relatively token. I think, if you actually said, look, this is public business, that it's important. We should pay you something realistic. And also, for that matter, we should have other guarantees. We should make sure you've got childcare provided. That should be provided. We should make sure that your employer will let you take the time off work, just the same way you get time off work for jury duty or something like that. There are all kinds of very easy and obvious steps you can take to make taking part in a randomly selected citizen body more attractive. Now, it'll never make people fall in love with it. Like you say, people are not in love with serving on a jury, but I think you can get people to the point where they'll say, look, okay, it's an important public job. It's got to be done. I'll go do it. I think we could do more of that with juries too, by the way, that would also help.
Yeah, they didn't even offer travel expenses for the.
Oh, they paid expenses. They put people up in a hotel. They did pay that.
Oh.
There was no direct remuneration, but yes, they fed them, they housed them, they got them there. That part they did.
Okay.
They did do. So yeah, I don't want to. I mean, it was a little cheap, but I don't want to make them sound too cheap. The fair credit where credit is due.
Okay. So again, comparing Athens and our modern use of sortition, and of course acknowledging that sortition probably hasn't achieved its complete fruition yet. But is there anything that we are forgetting in our modern use of sortition? Is there anything that we've improved upon when we consider the Athenian experience?
Well, there is, I think, one very big difference between the Athenian experience and the modern experience. And it's reflected in some of the arguments that are made for these citizens' assemblies. One of the arguments that is central to a lot of the case for randomly selected citizen bodies, the term you'll often hear used is a mini public. This is a mini public. It's like the public brought together in miniature. And that's why you have to stratify. That's why, for example, you have to say, well, we're worried about way more men participating than women, or way more older people participating than younger people. So we'll stratify and to make sure that that happens. And we're doing that because we want the citizen jury. You know, you have a citizen assembly in Idaho, you want it to look like Idaho. You know, if you have a citizen assembly in Ireland, you want it to look like Ireland. And this is a very modern idea, and it comes out of the revolution in polling that took place in the 20th century. And it's hard to see how it could have existed in ancient times. The ancient Athenians didn't talk about random selection, didn't talk about sortition in these terms. And guess what? One of the reasons is because probability theory, as we know it, didn't exist yet. Probability theory is a modern invention. Statistics is a modern invention. If you know, the Athenians didn't have the language to talk about the idea that, oh, this is going to create a microcosm for the entire public. So they talked about the role that sortition does in very different terms, and it doesn't have this central focus. Now, that could be good or could be bad, depending on your point of view. I think, like I said, most fans of sortition today say one of the most attractive things about it is the fact that it makes this microcosm possible. It makes it possible to have, you know, there was this famous experiment that was called America in One Room. You know, it's like you can in a sense have, it's as if you had a miniature of the entire country or the entire city or the entire whatever you're trying to represent. But that's a very modern idea, very modern innovation.
And we're not forgetting anything, leaving anything behind.
Well, I think that one of the things that we don't talk about the Athenians' usage is the way they would use random selection for, not just for these deliberative bodies where you come together and think about things. You know, they also like to think about, for example, administrative kind of roles that they delegated. It's interesting that no one ever thinks in those terms about things like, you know, I mean, that was for the Athenians, that would be like, okay, we got to select a team of people to inspect the docks, or we got to expect a team of people to go to the marketplace and make sure people aren't cheating with the weights and stuff like that, you know, when they're selling stuff. So they were happy to use it in a variety of other ways. Now, a lot of those jobs today, we'd say, well, you got to have professional bureaucrats to do that, because the Athenians didn't have a professional bureaucracy. The only professionals they had on staff for a lot of these jobs were slaves, which we can't really do now. But it's interesting that they were really willing to kind of push the boundaries in terms of like just how many tasks could you trust to amateurs, how much could you trust to people who are not professional politicians. And you know, I mean, I think it's always good as we look at the political process now, we ask, you know, okay, where is there space for ordinary citizens? Maybe not everywhere, but it's always worth asking.
All right, well, that's all I got for today. Is there anything you'd like to add? And please tell us about your books too before we finish.
Well, that was, of course, something I'd like to add there. Yes, well, I would definitely, I would encourage people who are interested. I'll just show, I have two books that may or may not be of interest here, but this was the book I wrote, The Luck of the Draw, The Role of Lotteries in Decision Making. And this is a book where I talk about a number of different uses that one can put random selection to. I talk not just about the political uses, but about a way they get used in other parts, in making other kinds of decisions. For example, they sometimes get used to decide, okay, who gets into that very desirable magnet school or charter school or something like that. They sometimes get used to decide, okay, who gets, you know, perhaps that if, you know, when vaccines are scarce, who might get that vaccine at first, that scarce medical resource first, those kind of things. Who gets into public housing? Who gets drafted in the armed forces? So I talk about a wide variety of public uses of random selection and why we do that, and why we might want to use that more often. And then I have this other book I edited here, Lotteries in Public Life. And this is a collection of some of the most important, I'd say, classic papers that have been written over the years on the theory and practice of random selection. Again, looking at this whole vast array of cases where random selection has been used and trying to look at, draw some conclusions about what do they have in common, what are the advantages of using random selection, what are the disadvantages, where does it make sense, where does it not make sense to use them, that sort of thing. So definitely I would encourage anyone who wants to read up on those to check those out.
All right, thank you very much. This has been very enjoyable. I encourage everybody to go out and buy those books and read them and apply sortition to your community. Until next time, long live the Republic.
Thanks, John.
Wait.